The sun was slowly rising over the wide open land, coloring the sky with shades of gold and soft orange. The prairie stretched as far as the eye could see. Dry grass waved gently in the cool morning wind. In the distance, a hawk circled high above, watching for anything that moved. This was a quiet place, far away from the noise of busy towns and crowded streets. For many, it was too lonely. But for Eli Ward, it was home. Eli was a rancher who lived alone. His small wooden house stood in the middle of the open land like a tiny island in a wide, endless sea. A few horses grazed near the fence. 2 old cows moved slowly, their heads down, finding bits of grass that had not dried up yet. Eli had built everything with his own hands: the fence, the barn, the house, even the narrow well where he drew water each morning. Most people in nearby towns didn't know much about him. They only said he was a quiet man who didn't visit often, a man who minded his own business and never asked for help. And they were right. Eli liked silence. He liked the soft sound of the wind through the grass. He liked the way the stars shone brighter here at night than anywhere else. It had been years since he had lived near other people, and he didn't miss it. But that morning was different. As Eli walked along the fence line with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, he saw something unusual. At first he thought it was just the wind moving through the grass. But then he noticed a shape. Someone or something was lying near the far corner of the fence. Eli stopped walking. He narrowed his eyes and shaded them with his hand. The shape didn't move at first. Then it did. It was a person. He set his cup on a fence post and started walking carefully toward the figure. Years of living alone had made him cautious. On the prairie, surprises were rarely good. The grass brushed against his boots as he got closer. It was a girl. She was lying on her side, her knees drawn up slightly, as if she had been running and then fallen from exhaustion. Her clothes were torn in places and covered in dust. She looked thin, like she hadn't eaten properly in days. Long dark hair fell over her face, and when she opened her eyes, Eli saw something sharp in them. Not fear, not weakness, but strength. Eli didn't speak at first. He didn't move too fast either. The girl stared at him, her breathing quick and shallow. She didn't seem to trust anyone. "You all right?" Eli asked softly. The girl didn't answer. She just kept staring at him as if deciding whether he was friend or foe. Eli slowly lowered himself to one knee, making sure she could see his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was calm, steady, like water moving slowly over smooth stones. The girl's lips were dry, cracked from the sun. She whispered something in a language Eli didn't understand, but her eyes flicked to his hands and then to the house in the distance. Eli stood again, but not too close. "If you can walk, I've got water. Food too." She didn't answer right away. For a long moment, the wind was the only sound between them. Then slowly she pushed herself up on shaky arms. Eli stepped forward to offer help, but she flinched, pulling back like a wild bird not used to human touch. He didn't force it. He just waited. After a few seconds, the girl stood on her own. She was barefoot. Her feet were scratched and dusty, but she didn't complain. Eli admired that kind of strength silently. He started walking toward the house and looked back once to make sure she followed. She hesitated, glanced behind her at the empty prairie, and then took a small step. Then another, and another. Inside the house, Eli poured cool water from the bucket near the door and handed it to her. She drank it quickly, almost too quickly, like someone who hadn't felt safe enough to drink slowly for days. He handed her a second cup, and she took it without a word. Eli set a piece of bread and some dried meat on the table. She didn't touch the meat but ate the bread slowly, watching him the entire time. Her eyes were sharp, alert, like a small animal ready to run if anything seemed wrong. "My name's Eli," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "Eli Ward, this is my land." "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Naya." Her voice was low, rough from thirst, but steady. Eli nodded slowly. "All right, Naya," she said nothing more. But Eli didn't need her to explain everything right then. He'd seen enough to know she wasn't just some traveler lost on the prairie. There was a story behind those tired eyes, a hard story. That evening, as the sun sank low and turned the land orange and gold, Eli sat on his porch, rocking slowly in his old chair. Naya was inside, resting on a blanket he'd laid near the fireplace. She had fallen asleep almost as soon as she sat down. Eli stared out across the plains and tried to make sense of what had happened. It wasn't the first time strangers had passed through these lands. But there was something different about this girl. Something the townsfolk would not ignore. He knew what people said in town. There had been talk for weeks, talk about raids, missing livestock, stolen supplies. Every problem they couldn't explain was blamed on someone they didn't trust. Recently, all that blame had fallen on one group. They said an Apache girl had killed a man. Nobody had seen it happen, but that didn't stop the whispers. They had already decided she was guilty. Someone had even promised to hang her as soon as they caught her. Eli didn't believe everything he heard. People in town liked simple stories, even when the truth was more complicated. When he found Naya, he had a feeling, almost a quiet certainty, that she was the one they were talking about. And now she was in his house. That night, the wind grew stronger. It rattled the windows and pushed against the old door. Eli couldn't sleep. He got up, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself another cup of water. The floor creaked under his boots. He walked to the fireplace and looked down at Naya. She wasn't fully asleep anymore. Her eyes were half open, as if she didn't fully trust rest. She watched him quietly. "You can stay here tonight," Eli said. "No one will bother you here." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened just slightly. Eli sat on the chair near the window and watched the prairie under the moonlight. He thought about how much trouble he might be bringing on himself. If the men in town found out, they wouldn't care about explanations. They'd call him a traitor for helping her. But as he sat there, he knew what his choice would be. He had made it the moment he carried her inside. He had lived alone long enough to stop caring about what others thought. He believed in what his own eyes saw, and his eyes saw a tired, frightened girl, not a criminal. The next morning came with a pink sky and quiet air. Eli stepped outside to feed the animals. He noticed something in the distance, a cloud of dust. Riders. His stomach tightened slightly. He turned to look at the house. Naya was standing at the window watching too. She didn't need to ask who they were. She already knew. Eli wiped his hands on his trousers and stood still, watching the riders grow larger as they came closer. He recognized a few of them from town, men who liked to talk loud and act tougher than they were. He knew why they were coming. They had tracked her. Inside the house, Naya turned from the window. Her face was calm, but Eli saw something else behind her eyes. Not fear, but the weight of someone who had run too long. Eli walked inside and closed the door gently. "They'll be here soon," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't ask him to let her go either. That silence meant something. She trusted him, at least a little. As the riders neared, Eli's mind felt sharper, clearer. He had spent years alone, but he wasn't a weak man. He had made choices before that cost him comfort. He could make another now. This wasn't about land or cattle. It was about what was right. When the hooves finally thundered against the ground near the fence, Eli didn't step back. He stepped forward. Naya stood behind the door, out of sight, but ready. The frontier was a place where trust was rare and hard. But sometimes, in the quiet space between danger and courage, a single decision could change everything. Eli didn't know how the day would end, but he knew one thing clearly. He wouldn't let them take her away without hearing the truth first. The wind carried the sound of approaching voices. Dust swirled up from the horses' feet. The prairie, usually so calm in the morning, now held its breath. Something had begun that could not be undone. The riders came closer, their horses moving in a slow but firm rhythm. Dust lifted from the ground and hung in the air like a curtain. Eli stood near the front of his fence, his boots pressed into the dry soil, his hands resting at his sides. He didn't move. The men stopped a few yards away. Their faces were hard, sunburned, and tired. Most of them were familiar from the town. There was Hank, the blacksmith who liked to speak louder than everyone else. There was Carter, who always looked for trouble when things got quiet. And in the middle sat a man wearing a brown hat and a long coat, Sheriff Dalton. The sheriff's voice carried across the fence. "Mornin', Eli." Eli gave a slow nod. "Mornin'," Dalton shifted in his saddle. "We're looking for a girl," he said simply. Eli didn't answer right away. The wind moved between them like a whisper. Hank leaned forward. "She was seen running this way last night," he said. "We know she's out here somewhere. Folks in town ain't happy, Eli. You know what's been said." Eli's face stayed calm, but inside his thoughts were moving fast. He could lie. He could say he hadn't seen anyone, but that would only make things worse. He also knew what would happen if he gave her up without a word. They wouldn't ask questions. "She's here," Eli said at last, his voice steady. The men shifted slightly, surprised by his honesty. Dalton narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying you're keeping her?" "You know what they're saying about her. She's been marked. People think she's dangerous." Eli looked him straight in the eye. "I've heard what people say. Doesn't make it true." Behind the closed door of the house, Naya was standing near the window. She watched every movement outside, her heart beating fast, though her face stayed calm. She had seen groups like this before, groups that didn't listen, only decided. She knew how quickly people could choose sides without knowing the truth. The sheriff took a deep breath. "Eli," he said slowly, "you're a good man. No one wants trouble. But if you protect her, you'll bring the town against you." Eli didn't flinch. "I'm not turning away someone who needs help just because a few folks decided to point fingers." The silence grew heavier. A few birds flew away from the trees nearby, as if even they could feel something was about to happen. Meanwhile, on the far hills, something else was unfolding. A few Apache scouts had seen everything from a distance. They knew Naya. She was part of their community, someone loved and trusted. When she had been taken weeks ago, her people had searched for her endlessly. They watched as the group gathered near Eli's ranch. The wind carried the sound of voices to them. They saw horses, men, and anger in the air. The scouts exchanged quiet glances. They knew they could not stay hidden for long. Back at the fence, Carter finally spoke. "This ain't your fight, Eli," he said, shaking his head. "Why risk everything for her? She ain't your family. She ain't your problem." Eli looked past the men for a moment, over the land he had lived on for years. It was a land he had built piece by piece with quiet effort, and for the first time in a long while it didn't feel so empty. "She's not my problem," Eli said. "She's a person. That's enough." The words hung in the air, firm and simple. Hank muttered something under his breath, but the sheriff raised a hand to stop him. Dalton was no fool. He had known Eli a long time. The rancher rarely spoke, but when he did, he meant every word. The sheriff turned his horse a little to the side. "Eli," he said slowly, "this is bigger than just her. The whole town's talking. Some are scared. Some are angry. If something happens out here, it won't just end at your fence. It'll spread. You can't stop people when they're afraid." Eli understood. Fear was louder than truth. He'd seen it before. But he also knew something else. Someone had to stand firm or the fear would just keep growing. Before anyone could say more, the sound of another group reached their ears. The men turned toward the hills. Figures appeared along the ridge, silent and steady. The Apache scouts had arrived. They did not rush or shout. They simply came forward like a quiet wave, moving with purpose. The men at the fence shifted nervously. Hank's hands clenched on his reins. Carter looked uneasy. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, calculating the situation. Eli didn't move. He had expected this. The two groups stood facing each other across the open prairie, with Eli's small ranch in the middle like a line drawn in the dirt. Naya stepped outside. She walked slowly, carefully, her chin lifted high. The men from town turned their heads. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with something harder to name. But she didn't look down. She had run for too long to hide now. When the Apache scouts saw her, a soft sound rose among them, a quiet breath of relief. One of the older men stepped forward, his eyes kind but firm. Dalton spoke first. "This land's not a place for a standoff," he said, his voice lower now. "Nobody wants a storm," the Apache man replied in slow, careful English. "She is our own." She did nothing. Lies made her a target. The sheriff shifted again. He looked at Eli. He looked at the men behind him. And then at Naya, who stood still with the quiet strength of someone who had no more fear left to give. Hank shook his head. "You really gonna listen to them?" he muttered. "We all heard what happened. No one saw anything," Eli interrupted firmly. "They only heard what someone wanted them to hear." The words hit hard because they were true. The town story about Naya had always been built on rumors, not facts. Dalton rubbed his chin. He had his own doubts about the story, but had never spoken them aloud. The town's anger had grown too fast. It was easier to go along than to question. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman from the Apache group came forward. She carried a small leather pouch, and inside it were tokens, small handmade signs of trust. She held them up for everyone to see. She was taken, the woman said softly, not guilty. A woman from town made it happen. A woman who feared blame. Dalton's brow furrowed. The sheriff knew who she meant. He remembered whispers, quiet talks behind doors, half-told truths. The tension in the air began to shift. The men who had come to capture Naya were no longer as sure as they had been that morning. The wind that had felt hard now seemed lighter. Hank looked uneasy. Carter stared down at his boots. Only the sheriff held the silence steady. Finally, Dalton spoke. "We can't undo what's been said," he said slowly. "But maybe we can stop what comes next." The sun climbed higher in the sky, spreading a warm light across the land. For a long time, no one moved. The sheriff finally took off his hat, ran his hand through his hair, and sighed. "She stays here for now," he said, looking at Eli. "No one touches her. I'll talk to the town." The other men stared at him in surprise. Hank opened his mouth to argue, but Dalton's sharp glance silenced him. Eli gave a short nod. Naya stood quietly behind him, the wind gently lifting strands of her hair. The Apache scouts relaxed slightly, but their eyes remained alert. They knew trust did not come in a single moment, but this was a beginning. The men from town rode back the way they had come, their horses kicking up smaller clouds of dust than before. Their anger was thinner now, replaced by uneasy questions they could no longer ignore. Eli watched them go. The sheriff turned once to look back at him, and Eli understood. Things would not be easy, but the worst of the storm had passed. Naya turned toward the hills where her people stood waiting. She took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like someone running. She felt seen. The older Apache man approached Eli. He didn't offer many words, just a quiet nod, the kind of nod that carried respect. Eli nodded back. Later, as the day grew softer, Eli sat on his porch again. The prairie was quiet. Naya sat near the barn watching the horses. She didn't smile, but there was a calmness around her now that hadn't been there before. Eli leaned back in his chair and looked at the horizon. The land was still the same grass, the same wind, the same sun. But something had changed inside him. For so long he had kept to himself, believing the world's problems were not his. But that morning he had stood for something. He had chosen truth over fear. He didn't know what would come next. Maybe the town would still talk. Maybe people would still carry their doubts. But he also knew that the story of that day would not be as simple as the rumors they once believed. It would be about a girl who stood with quiet strength. About people who showed up to protect her. About a rancher who decided to draw a line, not out of anger, but out of simple, honest courage. The wind moved through the prairie like a soft song, and Eli, the loner rancher, was no longer as alone as before.